At first glance, it doesn't seem like much. It's just an old bag, probably lost, maybe left behind by a hiker. But then you spot something, a small ID tag attached to the zipper. Curiosity tugs at you, and you take a closer look. The name on the tag is familiar. You blink. It can't be. The person whose name is on this tag has been missing for over 20 years. How is that possible? How did a backpack belonging to someone who disappeared so long ago end up here, in the middle of nowhere? You feel a rush of confusion. You might think to yourself, this can't be real. There must be some explanation. But then, the moment you hold that ID tag, something inside you changes. You realize that you've just uncovered a mystery that has remained unsolved for 2 decades. And as you stand there, holding that faded tag, the questions flood in: who left this backpack here? Why did they leave it? And most importantly, where has the person who disappeared been all these years? Now, before you make any assumptions, let me tell you, the truth is stranger than anything you could have imagined. The story you're about to hear is one that will shake you to your core, leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about disappearances and mysteries, and challenge the way we think about the past. You're going to hear a story that begins with a family finding a backpack in the forest, but it doesn't stop there. Oh no. That's just the beginning. The search for answers will pull you into a web of secrets, lies, and shocking revelations that no one could have seen coming. Trust me when I say, by the end of this video, you're going to have questions, and I promise, you're going to want those answers. Let's take a step back for a moment and get to the heart of it. This isn't just any backpack. The discovery of this bag sets off a series of events that unravel a mystery that's been buried for over 2 decades. The ID tag inside. It belongs to a young man named Jason Miller, who went missing in 1998. Jason was just 18 years old when he disappeared without a trace. His family was devastated, the search efforts were relentless, but the case went cold. And just when they thought they had no hope left, this same backpack, was found, an eerie, long-forgotten clue that could finally crack the case wide open. But the more investigators dug into it, the more chilling details emerged. You're probably thinking, wait, how is this possible? How can something from 1998 just show up now? That's exactly what the authorities wanted to know too. The backpack itself wasn't just a random find, it was a piece of the puzzle, a crucial link to what happened to Jason. But as they pieced together the clues, things didn't add up. It seemed as though Jason's disappearance wasn't the simple tragedy everyone assumed it to be. And that's where the mystery truly begins. Let's talk about the podcast. You see, this backpack didn't just remain an unsolved mystery in the backwoods. It sparked something bigger, a podcast dedicated to uncovering cold cases and unsolved disappearances. The host of this podcast, a true crime enthusiast named Sarah Green, took on the case of Jason Miller. Sarah had a knack for uncovering the overlooked details, the things that everyone else missed, and as she dug into the case, she discovered something unsettling. The more she learned, the more it seemed like Jason's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. The deeper she went, the more she uncovered about a network of unsolved cases from the same time period, cases that were connected in ways no one had imagined. Sarah's podcast wasn't just about finding out what happened to one man, it was about finding out what happened to dozens of missing people, all linked by a single thread. But here's where it gets even more mind-blowing. The answers didn't just lie in the past. As Sarah uncovered more details, she started to connect the dots between Jason's disappearance and a mysterious group that no one had heard of before, an underground operation, with ties to people in the community, with a reach much broader than anyone could have guessed. But why? Why would this group be involved with Jason's disappearance? What did they want? What were they covering up? Sarah's podcast turned from a search for closure to an investigation that would expose secrets buried so deep, they might never have seen the light of day. She wasn't just talking about a missing person anymore. She was uncovering a hidden world, one that some very powerful people didn't want the public to know about. I know you're probably sitting there right now, glued to the screen, eager to know what happened next. You're wondering how this all connects, what this mysterious group had to do with Jason's disappearance, and how on earth a backpack from 1998 was the key to unlocking such a monumental truth. Don't worry, you're not alone. I'm right here with you, and I'll make sure we uncover every piece of this mystery, step by step, so you'll get all the answers you've been waiting for. But before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you're enjoying this story so far, stick with me. Don't click away just yet. I promise you that by the time this video ends, you'll be on the edge of your seat, absolutely stunned by the twists and turns that no one saw coming. You're going to hear about things that will change the way you think about missing persons cases forever. And trust me, when you finally hear the truth, the full, complete truth, you'll be left speechless, just like I was when I first learned it. Now, before we dive deeper into the investigation and reveal how Sarah's podcast unraveled this whole thing, let's take a step back. Let's examine the circumstances of Jason's disappearance. Because once you understand the full scope of what happened that fateful night in 1998, you'll begin to see how everything connects. It's not just about a missing person. It's about a pattern, a cover-up, and a conspiracy that goes beyond anything you could imagine. This is only the beginning, and trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. So, are you ready to discover the truth? As Sarah Green dug deeper into Jason Miller's case, she began to uncover a series of events that, on the surface, seemed like a tragedy, a missing person, a grieving family, a community that had long since given up hope. But as she sifted through old police reports, interviews with family and friends, and the incomplete investigations from decades ago, the story began to shift. It wasn't just about a boy who had gone missing, it was about a series of missed opportunities, overlooked evidence, and an unsettling pattern that nobody had noticed at the time. Jason Miller had been a typical teenager in many ways, from what his family and friends had told Sarah. He was a bright, energetic young man, full of potential, with a future ahead of him. But the weeks leading up to his disappearance were far from ordinary. A month before he vanished, Jason's behavior had started to change. Friends noticed that he'd been distant, withdrawn, and even a little paranoid at times. He'd stopped showing up to hang out with his usual group of friends, stopped attending parties, and had even cut off contact with his closest confidants. When his family asked him what was wrong, he gave vague, evasive answers, nothing specific, just a lot of "I'm fine and I've got things to sort out." But things didn't feel right. Jason's mother, Rachel Miller, recalled one particular evening a few weeks before his disappearance that haunted her to this day. Jason had come home late, looking over his shoulder as if someone was following him. Rachel had asked him what was going on, but Jason simply told her that he was just being paranoid. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, but Rachel had always trusted her instincts, and something about that moment stuck with her. She wished now that she'd pressed him more, asked more questions. But at the time, she had chalked it up to typical teenage angst. Maybe he was dealing with a breakup, or maybe he was just stressed out about his future. But now, knowing what she knew, Rachel couldn't help but wonder if that was the moment when everything began to unravel. When Jason vanished without a trace, it sent shockwaves through the small town. The police immediately started the search, interviewing friends, family, and anyone who might have seen him in the days leading up to his disappearance. But the answers they got didn't make much sense. There were rumors, always rumors in a tight-knit community. Some claimed that Jason had run away, that he had gotten involved with the wrong crowd, and that he was trying to escape something. Others whispered about a mysterious man who had been seen talking to Jason in the days before he disappeared, a man who had never been identified. And still others speculated that Jason had gotten involved in something darker, something that was beyond the reach of the police. But no one knew for sure, and the case eventually grew cold. Fast forward to 2023, when Sarah Green first picked up the thread of Jason's story for her true crime podcast, The Vanishing Point. Sarah had always been fascinated by unsolved disappearances, particularly those that seemed to have no clear explanation. But Jason's case stood out. The more she read about him, the more she became intrigued by the gaps in the investigation. Why had Jason suddenly withdrawn from his friends and family? What was he involved in during those last weeks? And who was this mysterious man that no one had ever been able to identify? As Sarah began to piece the details together, she started to uncover unsettling connections. She reached out to some of Jason's old friends, hoping for more insight, but the responses she received were as vague as the ones from 2 decades ago. One friend, Jake Thompson, had been one of Jason's closest confidants, but when Sarah contacted him, he seemed evasive, almost too eager to avoid talking about the past. It wasn't that Jake didn't care about what had happened to his old friend, it was that he seemed terrified to get involved. His reluctance piqued Sarah's curiosity even more. What was Jake hiding? And why was he so unwilling to revisit that time in his life? Then there was Melanie Carter, Jason's ex-girlfriend. At first, she was cooperative, even helpful, as Sarah listened to her recount the details of their relationship. But there was something off about Melanie's story. She claimed to have no idea why Jason had started acting strange, but she also mentioned something that caught Sarah's attention. Melanie had been the last person to see Jason on the day he disappeared. She claimed that they had had a fight, a breakup, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Melanie was hiding something. As Sarah pushed for more information, Melanie grew defensive, her words increasingly unconvincing. It was as though she was playing a game of cat and mouse with Sarah, providing just enough information to keep the conversation going, but never enough to make sense of the situation. Could it be that Melanie knew more about Jason's disappearance than she was letting on? Or was she, too, just another victim of the mysterious forces that had ensnared Jason? And then there were the whispers about a local figure who had been connected to several other missing persons cases in the area around the time Jason disappeared. This man, Ray Hawkins, was known for his criminal ties, though he had never been officially linked to any crimes. Sarah had heard his name mentioned in passing during her interviews, but when she looked deeper into his history, she found a series of bizarre connections to the case. Ray was known for his shady dealings and run-ins with the law, but he was also surprisingly well liked by some people in the community, a fact that made him all the more difficult to figure out. Could Ray Hawkins have played a role in Jason's disappearance? Or was he merely a red herring, another suspect whose presence in the case was more coincidental than criminal? As Sarah's investigation gained traction, she began to realize that the pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together as neatly as she had hoped. With every new interview, every new clue, the story grew more complicated. Who could be trusted? Who had the answers? And who was lying? And most of all, why did Jason Miller's disappearance still remain unsolved after all these years? The more Sarah uncovered, the more it seemed like there was a bigger conspiracy at play, one that involved people who had been hiding the truth for far too long. But just as she thought she was getting closer to the answers, something happened that would change the course of her investigation forever. One afternoon, Sarah received an anonymous tip. The message was simple, cryptic, and chilling. The truth is closer than you think. But you're looking in the wrong place. It was a slap in the face, a hint that someone knew more than they were letting on. But who could it be? Was it someone from Jason's past? A family member? Or was there something deeper, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of this small town? The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that everything she had uncovered so far might just be the tip of the iceberg. Something much bigger was at play, and she was getting dangerously close to it. But as she followed the trail, she couldn't help but wonder, was she too close? Was someone watching her every move, just waiting for her to make one mistake? As Sarah pressed on, she knew that the answers were just within reach. But every step forward seemed to uncover more questions. And with every new piece of information, the mystery of Jason Miller's disappearance grew more twisted, more complicated, and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The truth was out there, but the closer Sarah got to it, the more she realized that uncovering it might come with a cost that she wasn't ready to pay. And as you're sitting here, watching this, you're probably wondering the same thing. What happens next? What is the truth? And who, exactly, is behind it all? Stick with me, because the answers are coming, and trust me, you won't believe where this story goes next. As Sarah delved deeper into the investigation, the sense of urgency began to rise, and with it, an unexpected shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the unanswered questions that were weighing on her now, it was the growing feeling that someone was actively trying to derail her progress, as if the truth she was chasing had become a threat. Every time she thought she was closing in on something significant, it slipped away. And soon, she found herself facing obstacles that she hadn't anticipated, obstacles that made her question everything she thought she knew. It started subtly at first. Sarah had made a breakthrough with a former police officer named John Harris, who had worked on Jason's case back when he first disappeared. Harris had always been quiet about the details, but when Sarah reached out to him, he had agreed to speak under the condition of anonymity. The conversation seemed promising. Harris confirmed some of the inconsistencies in the original investigation and hinted at a crucial piece of evidence that had been mysteriously removed from the case file. According to him, the police had recovered a set of fingerprints from Jason's abandoned car shortly after his disappearance, but for some reason, those prints never made it to the lab for analysis. Harris didn't have all the answers, but he was convinced that those fingerprints could have led to a suspect if only they hadn't vanished. But just days after their conversation, something strange happened. Sarah received an encrypted email from Harris, explaining that he'd been told to stop talking about the case. It was vague but chilling. The message simply read, "They know you're digging. Get out while you still can." The fear in his words was palpable. The man who had once been a pillar of the investigation was now scared to even communicate with her. And that's when Sarah realized she wasn't just chasing a cold case anymore. She was up against something much bigger, something that involved people with far more power and influence than she had ever imagined. A day later, the plot thickened. Sarah went to retrieve the physical evidence from her office, a small box containing a few files and documents related to Jason Miller's disappearance, only to find that it had been tampered with. Some of the most crucial papers, including notes about the mysterious fingerprints, were missing. The folder had been left open, but there was no sign of forced entry into her office. The only explanation was that someone had been watching her, someone who had been able to access her space without leaving a trace. At that moment, Sarah's heart sank. Was someone trying to intimidate her? Or worse, was there a deeper conspiracy at play? The feeling of paranoia grew with each passing hour. Sarah couldn't shake the thought that someone was one step ahead of her, always keeping her just far enough from the truth to make her doubt herself. She started to look over her shoulder more often, questioning the intentions of the people around her. The subtle threats, the unexplained disappearances, they were all starting to form a pattern. But who was orchestrating it all? Who had the resources to control the investigation so thoroughly, even all these years later? And why? What did they have to hide? To make matters worse, Sarah's so-called ally, Jake Thompson, who had seemed so eager to help her at first, began acting even more strangely. He had been a close friend of Jason's, and Sarah had hoped he could provide valuable insights into Jason's life, but now, he was being uncomfortably evasive. At first, he offered helpful hints, pointing her to key locations Jason had frequented in the days leading up to his disappearance. But now, every time Sarah reached out to him, he became more distant. The last conversation they had was a mix of cryptic comments and half-answers, leaving Sarah to wonder if he was still hiding something or worse, if he had turned against her. Something had changed in Jake. He was no longer the helpful source he had once been. And now, every time Sarah tried to follow up on a lead, Jake's answers seemed deliberately misleading, steering her away from crucial information. The tension was mounting, and Sarah found herself stuck in a spiral of doubts and confusion. It wasn't just the evidence disappearing or the cryptic warnings, it was the unsettling feeling that people who she thought she could trust were either being manipulated or hiding something much darker. But what was the truth? What could she uncover about Jason's disappearance that was worth all this danger, all this secrecy? Every step forward seemed to bring a new dead end, and for every answer she thought she had, more questions arose. Then came a turning point, one that would shake Sarah to her core. Late one night, she received a phone call. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but the tone was urgent, almost frantic. The caller didn't give their name, but they claimed to have crucial information about Jason's disappearance. The person on the other end was insistent that Sarah meet them in person, claiming they had uncovered a significant piece of evidence that could break the case wide open. But there was a catch: Sarah had to come alone. No police. No recording equipment. Just her and the mystery caller. As tempting as it was, Sarah knew that this was the type of situation where everything could go horribly wrong. Her instincts screamed at her not to go, that this could be a trap, a setup to intimidate her further or even silence her. Yet, the part of her that had been chasing the truth for months, the part that couldn't let go, knew that this might be the break she had been waiting for. But who could she trust? Could this person be another pawn in the same game that was already trying to derail her? Or was this the crucial moment she had been waiting for, The moment where everything finally made sense. Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed to meet. The location was a small, nondescript diner on the edge of town, an old building that had been around for decades, now more rundown than anything. The place was eerily quiet, as if it were frozen in time, with only a few regulars scattered around the dimly lit room. As Sarah walked in, her eyes scanned the booths, looking for her mysterious informant. Her heart raced as she sat down in the farthest corner, waiting. It felt like hours before the door opened, and a figure stepped inside, cloaked in shadow. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was someone she never expected to see, someone she thought had disappeared from her life years ago. The last person she ever thought would show up in the middle of this investigation, someone who had disappeared without a trace after Jason's disappearance, someone who held the key to the entire mystery. But why were they here now? And why had they waited until this very moment to make their presence known? As Sarah stared across the table at this unexpected visitor, she realized that nothing about this case was as it seemed. Every person, every clue, every lead had now become a puzzle piece in a game she could barely understand. And as the person slid a crumpled envelope across the table to her, Sarah's mind raced with the possibilities. What had been hidden for so long? What dark truth was waiting in that envelope? Was it the answer she'd been searching for, or was it another trap set to pull her further into a web of deceit? She had no choice but to open it. But as she did, a sickening thought flashed through her mind. Was she finally about to uncover the truth, or had she just walked straight into a deadly lie? The envelope contained a single photograph, and it was one that would change everything. But what was it? What did it mean? The answer, for now, remains just out of reach. As Sarah sat frozen, staring at the crumpled photograph in front of her, the world seemed to blur. The photo wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a clue that tied Jason's disappearance to any one person or event. Instead, it was a photo of her, taken from behind, just outside her apartment, from a distance. Her heart raced, the weight of realization sinking in. Someone had been watching her, and now they were sending her a message: stop digging. But why? What did this have to do with Jason Miller? Why had the focus shifted from the missing boy to her? The room around her felt suffocating, and her mind struggled to make sense of everything. This was no longer just a cold case, it was personal now. Whoever had orchestrated this investigation, whether it was the anonymous caller or the people behind the mysterious disappearances, had turned their attention toward her. She wasn't just uncovering a past she had no stake in anymore, she was now entangled in it. The lines between her role as an investigator and the people involved in this dark web were blurring. But why her? What was the significance of this photo? What connection did she have to these long-hidden secrets? Before Sarah could process the overwhelming realization, her phone buzzed, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. She looked down at the screen and saw a message from her closest friend and podcast co-producer, Ben Carson. Ben had been the steady hand behind the scenes, helping Sarah navigate the complexities of the case. He had been with her every step of the way, supporting her when the questions became too difficult, offering advice when the mystery seemed impossible to crack. He had become a trusted ally in this journey, someone Sarah relied on more than anyone else. But now, as she read his text, that sense of trust began to unravel. "Sarah, we need to talk. I just got something I can't explain. Meet me at the office. Urgent." Her pulse quickened. Ben's messages were usually straightforward, clear, even-tempered, but this one carried a sense of urgency that made Sarah uneasy. What had he discovered? And why did it sound like something was terribly wrong? She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Ben in danger too? Was he caught up in something deeper than he realized? When Sarah arrived at the office, she found the door ajar. Ben's usual organized workspace was in disarray, papers scattered across the desk, the faint smell of something burnt lingering in the air. It didn't take long for her to find him. He was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the screen of his computer, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. The dim light from the computer screen illuminated his face, but it did nothing to soften the expression of someone who had just seen something he couldn't understand. "Ben!" Sarah called, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" Ben slowly turned to face her, his lips tight as if he were holding something back. His eyes darted nervously to the pile of papers on his desk, as though he were weighing whether to tell her what he had discovered. Finally, he stood and motioned for her to sit down. It's the research you asked me to look into," Ben began, his voice low. "I went through some old records, trying to find any connection between Jason Miller's disappearance and, well, everything else you've uncovered. But I found something that doesn't make sense. You're not going to believe this, Sarah, but the records, they've been altered. The timeline doesn't add up." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. "What do you mean, altered?" Ben hesitated for a moment before pulling a folder from the drawer and opening it to reveal several printed pages of old police reports, some marked with dates, others with redacted sections. One sheet had a copy of the same fingerprint report Sarah had heard about from Officer Harris. But now, it was different. The fingerprints had been re-examined, but not by the police, by a private forensics company. According to the altered report, there was no match to anyone in the system, which contradicted everything Harris had told her about a potential suspect. But the most disturbing part of the documents was the name written at the bottom of the report, Ray Hawkins. It couldn't be a coincidence. The man who had been a shadow in the case, the one with the criminal ties, was now directly tied to the investigation through private channels, outside the purview of law enforcement. Ben's voice dropped to a whisper. "It looks like someone's been manipulating the investigation from the inside. Someone's been controlling the narrative for years, and it's tied to Hawkins. But there's more. Someone in the police department had to have been involved. I don't think Harris knew the full story, either. He was just a pawn. Whoever's behind this, they've been covering their tracks for a long time." Sarah sat back, the weight of the new discovery sinking in. Hawkins wasn't just a suspect, he was part of the cover-up. But the question lingered, why was Hawkins involved in this case at all? He wasn't connected to Jason, at least not in any clear way. What did he have to do with this mystery? And what had he been hiding for so long? As the pieces of the puzzle started to shift, the door to the office suddenly slammed shut. Sarah and Ben looked up, startled, to see a figure standing in the doorway, Jake Thompson. But this time, he wasn't the same person who had helped Sarah with interviews or pointed her to Jason's old haunts. There was something darker in his eyes, a flicker of something, guilt. Fear, that made Sarah's stomach drop. He wasn't supposed to be here. The door had been locked when she arrived, so how had he gotten in? "You shouldn't have come here," Jake said, his voice low and tense. "This is bigger than you think, Sarah. You're digging in the wrong place. There are people who won't hesitate to make you disappear, just like they did with Jason. You need to stop, before it's too late." The warning hung in the air like a heavy weight, and Sarah felt the walls of her own investigation closing in on her. What did Jake know? Was he threatening her, or was he just another victim, caught in the same trap she had fallen into? His words felt more like a plea than a warning, like someone who had been forced into a role they didn't want to play. But Sarah couldn't be sure. Was Jake an ally, a desperate man trying to save her from the truth? Or had he become yet another pawn in a much larger game? Ben looked back and forth between Sarah and Jake, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room was palpable, and every second felt like it might spiral into chaos. "What's going on, Jake? Who are you working for?" Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer to Sarah, his eyes locked on hers, as if weighing the gravity of his next words. "You're not the only one looking for answers. But be careful. There are people who have been watching you longer than you think." And just like that, everything Sarah thought she knew about the investigation was thrown into doubt. Was Jake really trying to protect her, or was he hiding something more sinister? The stakes had just been raised, and the pieces of the puzzle were scattering faster than she could put them together. With the sudden appearance of Jake, a new layer of uncertainty had been added to the mystery, and Sarah knew one thing for sure: nothing was what it seemed. The truth was still out there, but now, more than ever, Sarah wasn't sure who she could trust. Every move she made seemed to lead her deeper into a labyrinth of lies, deception, and danger. And the closer she got to the truth, the more she realized that someone didn't want her to find it. The tension in the air that night was suffocating, and as Sarah sat there, still reeling from Jake's ominous warning, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The unease that had been gnawing at her for weeks had grown into a constant presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. Every glance out the window, every creak in the floorboards, every shift in the shadows outside felt like a reminder that she wasn't alone, that someone was watching her every move. She had become a target, a pawn in a game she had only just begun to understand. But now, something shifted. The stakes weren't just high anymore, they were life or death. That night, after the confrontation with Jake, Sarah returned to her apartment, convinced that her every decision was being scrutinized. The streetlights outside her window flickered in the heavy silence of the early morning hours, and for the first time since this entire investigation had begun, she felt the undeniable weight of fear settling in her bones. But fear wasn't just a distant feeling anymore, it was real. The dread was closing in, and it wasn't just a vague, irrational feeling. She could feel the presence of someone, something just beyond the edges of her consciousness, lurking in the dark. Around 3 a.m., Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, still disoriented from the deep sleep she had somehow fallen into despite her racing thoughts. The message that greeted her was simple, chilling, and direct: "Stop or you'll regret it." No name. No number. Just the message. The kind of warning that chilled you straight through to your soul. At first, Sarah thought it might be a prank, but deep down, she knew this was different. The threat felt too real, too personal, too familiar to ignore. Someone had crossed a line. Whoever was watching her knew exactly where she was, what she was doing, and exactly how to get under her skin. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications. She thought about Ben. She thought about Jake. But mostly, she thought about the people who had been involved in Jason's disappearance, people whose names she hadn't even uncovered yet, people with dangerous connections, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. She stared at the message, her finger hovering over the reply button, but in the end, she couldn't bring herself to respond. That would be admitting that she was vulnerable, that she was terrified. And deep down, she knew that any response would be seen as a sign of weakness. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed again. The sound was jarring, like a knife cutting through the tense silence of the room. She glanced down. It was another message, this time from an unknown number. She clicked it open, her hands trembling as the words burned into her eyes. "You won't make it out alive. Leave the case. Or else." Her pulse quickened, and she felt a sharp, cold shiver run down her spine. This was no idle threat. Whoever was behind this knew too much about her, too much about the investigation. They knew where she lived, what she was doing, and they clearly had no problem making their intentions clear. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding as her eyes darted to the shadows in her apartment. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now seemed suffocating, closing in around her. She rushed to the window and pulled the curtain aside, peering out into the night. The street was eerily quiet, the empty sidewalks bathed in the harsh glow of streetlights. No one was out there. But that didn't mean she was alone. She had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her, that someone was waiting for her to make a mistake. She'd been followed before, she knew what it felt like to see shadows lurking just beyond her vision, to hear footsteps echoing just behind her. But this was different. This wasn't just paranoia. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling of unease. This was danger. Real danger. The thought that someone might be inside her apartment suddenly hit her like a wave. Her pulse quickened as she surveyed the room. It felt different now, as though every object, every corner of her apartment, had turned into something unfamiliar, something hostile. The closet door, half open, seemed to watch her. The kitchen light flickered on and off like some cruel reminder that she was trapped here. Sarah's mind raced as she mentally ran through the plan. Call the police? What could she tell them? A text from an anonymous number? A vague threat? It wasn't enough for them to act, not yet. But who else could she turn to? Ben? Jake? She didn't know who to trust anymore, not when everyone around her seemed to be tangled in the same web of lies. The silence in her apartment was suffocating, and then, just as she was about to make a decision, she heard it. The faintest sound, a creak, followed by the softest of footsteps, coming from the hallway just outside her door. It was so quiet, so deliberate, that it might have been her imagination playing tricks on her. But Sarah knew better. She wasn't imagining this. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively reached for her phone, but before she could grab it, there was another sound this time, a louder thud, followed by the unmistakable jingle of keys. Someone was outside her apartment door. Panic surged through her as she backed away from the door, every muscle in her body tensed and ready to react. Her mind was scrambling, fighting to process what was happening, but there was no time. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the knob began to turn. Slowly. Methodically. Someone was trying to get in. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, and her palms were slick with sweat. She wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words wouldn't come. She was frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then, as if the universe itself were conspiring to push her to the edge, her phone rang. The ringtone shattered the silence, the harsh noise like a bomb exploding in her mind. She snatched it up without thinking, not caring who was calling, just desperate to break the tension, to distract herself from the imminent danger. Sarah, Ben's voice crackled through the line, his tone tight, urgent. You need to listen to me. Something's happening. I think they're onto me too. The line went dead. She stared at her phone, eyes wide in disbelief. The call had been cut off. She didn't even have time to process what Ben had said before the door rattled again, this time with more force, as though someone was trying to break it down. The pounding sound of the door hitting the frame echoed through the apartment, and Sarah felt a cold wave of dread crash over her. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It wasn't just someone trying to scare her into stopping the investigation. It was a direct threat, someone was coming for her. And the door wouldn't hold up forever. She needed to move. Now. But where could she go? How could she escape when the very walls around her seemed to close in, trapping her in a nightmare of her own making? Her mind raced through options, but there were no easy answers, no escape routes that she could see. She had been warned, threatened, chased, and now, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The truth was so close, and yet, the more she uncovered, the more it felt like she was losing herself in a maze of danger, betrayal, and fear. The door trembled again, and this time, she could hear it. A voice. Muffled but clear. Someone was on the other side, speaking, whispering a single word that froze Sarah's blood: run. But where would she go? Who could she trust? The investigation had already cost her more than she could imagine, and now, the very people she had been trying to help, the ones she had been uncovering the truth for, might be the ones who would destroy her in the end. The mystery she had tried to solve had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Sarah realized, with a sickening clarity, that she might already be too deep to get out alive. The sound of the door crashing against the frame echoed in Sarah's mind as she stood frozen, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, to escape before whatever was outside managed to break through, but her feet were rooted to the floor. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, and for the first time, Sarah realized that she wasn't just up against the forces trying to keep the truth hidden, she was up against something much darker, something she hadn't seen coming. As her heart pounded in her ears, she glanced around the apartment one last time, her mind racing for any escape route. Her phone buzzed again, a brief flash of light cutting through the panic, but this time, it wasn't just a threat. It was a message from Ben. Sarah, they know. You've been set up. It's not what you think. Trust me. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her fingers trembled as she reread the message, trying to make sense of it. They know. Who was Ben talking about? Set up. Was she being played? Her mind went into overdrive. For weeks, Ben had been the one person she trusted in this mess. He was the one who'd sifted through records, guided her when things got rough, and even helped piece together clues that had led her this far. He'd always seemed like a loyal ally, but now, this message, it left a sickening taste in her mouth. What had Ben just implied? Was he part of the conspiracy, or was he trying to warn her? Before she could answer, the door rattled again, louder this time, and Sarah instinctively stepped back, holding her breath. A chill ran down her spine as she heard a faint voice calling from the hallway. Sarah, it's me. Please, let me in. The voice was unmistakable. It was Ben's. But something about the way he said it, the urgency in his tone, felt off. It didn't sound like the Ben she knew, the calm, collected co-producer she'd worked alongside for months. It sounded desperate. Panicked. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Why would Ben be outside her apartment? What had he meant by his cryptic message? And if he was outside her door, how had he gotten there so quickly? She hadn't heard any footsteps, hadn't seen anyone enter the building. The more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. But she couldn't ignore the voice, she couldn't let him think she was shutting him out. Shaking, she reached for the door handle, but something stopped her. A faint sound, coming from inside the apartment, made her freeze. It was a soft, almost imperceptible click, a sound that shouldn't have been there, like something shifting, something being tampered with. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as the realization slowly sank in. The sound hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from behind her. She turned, eyes wide with terror. The kitchen light was on. It hadn't been when she'd last checked. The soft glow illuminated the apartment's small, cramped space, casting long shadows against the walls. Then, in the corner of her eye, she caught something that shouldn't have been there, an envelope, barely visible, tucked underneath the edge of the kitchen counter. Her pulse raced as she walked toward it, her feet heavy with dread. It was the kind of envelope you'd expect to see in a spy movie, nondescript, unmarked, no return address. Her hands shook as she reached for it, tearing open the flap. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. When she unfolded it, her eyes went wide. It was a photograph. But not just any photograph, it was a picture of Sarah, from earlier that day, standing in the office with Ben, laughing at something trivial. But what made it impossible to ignore was what was written on the back: "She's next." The blood drained from her face as the full weight of what was happening crashed down on her. This wasn't just a case of someone trying to scare her into stopping. Someone was setting her up to take the fall for everything. The photo, the message, the threat, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion: Ben was involved. He wasn't just helping her. He was playing her. Her stomach lurched as she pieced everything together. Ben had always been there when she needed him most, always ready with an answer, a clue, or a suggestion. But what if he had been feeding her the wrong information all along? What if he'd been guiding her down a path, making sure she found certain things while covering up others? What if he was the one who had planted the false leads, manipulated the evidence, and watched as she unknowingly played right into his hands? Sarah felt the room closing in around her, the air thick with the crushing weight of betrayal. Just as she started to back away, her phone buzzed again, breaking the silence like a thunderclap. This time, it was a video message. Without thinking, Sarah hit play. The screen flickered for a moment before the video began to play. It showed Ben standing in the very same office where they'd been earlier. But in the video, he wasn't alone. There was another person standing beside him, someone Sarah didn't recognize, a man with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. "This is bigger than just one missing person," Ben said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "We can't let her get too close to the truth. She's been digging where she shouldn't. You know what to do." The video cut out abruptly, and for a long moment, Sarah just stood there, staring at the screen, unable to process what she had just seen. Ben. Ben was working with someone else. Someone who had a plan, a hidden agenda, and a clear objective to stop her from uncovering the truth. But who was this person? And why had Ben, someone she had trusted with her life, become part of this dark conspiracy? The fear that gripped Sarah now wasn't just the fear of being followed or threatened, it was the terrifying knowledge that she had been a pawn in a much larger game, one that had been set in motion long before she even realized it. The walls she had been trying to climb over were now closing in on her, and everyone she had thought she could trust had turned out to be someone else entirely. Was Ben a victim of the same forces that were after her? Or had he always been playing a different game, manipulating her from the very beginning? The mystery of Jason Miller, the missing boy, was no longer just about one case. It was about something much darker, something far-reaching, and far more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. She wasn't just uncovering the truth, she was becoming a part of it. A truth that would break everything she knew. And the people involved weren't going to stop until they silenced her for good. As Sarah stood there, the weight of betrayal heavy on her chest, the phone in her hand buzzed once more. The screen lit up with a new message, and as her eyes scanned the words, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. "You can't run, Sarah. We're already here." The room spun around her as the terrifying realization hit: whoever was behind all of this had been watching her all along. And now, it was too late to turn back. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and fury as she stared at the screen of her phone. The words echoed in her mind: "You can't run, Sarah. We're already here." The moment they appeared, everything inside her seemed to freeze, the world outside slipping away until all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart in her ears. She wasn't just being followed anymore, she wasn't just a pawn in some game. Whoever had sent that message had already set the trap, and now, she was caught in it. The terrifying realization hit her like a brick: they were close. Too close. It wasn't just a matter of following her anymore. Whoever was behind all of this knew her every move, had her under surveillance, and was willing to go to any lengths to make sure she didn't uncover the truth. The walls of her apartment, the apartment that had once felt like a safe haven, now felt like a cage. A cage that was slowly, steadily, closing in on her. She needed answers, but every answer seemed to bring more questions, and with each revelation, it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, breaking apart. Who could she trust? Who was lying? And, perhaps the hardest question of all, was she even strong enough to face the truth, no matter what it was? Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and for the first time since all of this started, she realized she was at a crossroads. The path she had been walking down had led her to a point where every choice now felt impossible. She couldn't keep going down this road without risking her life, but she also couldn't turn back, not when she was so close. But the message, that chilling ultimatum, had made it clear that she would have to make a choice, and she wasn't sure she could live with either option. The truth was waiting for her, but so was the danger. So was the risk. Could she really go through with it? She stood in the middle of the apartment, feeling like she was suffocating. Her eyes darted to the front door, where Ben had been knocking moments ago, calling to her in desperation. His voice had sounded so real, so full of urgency, but now she knew it could have all been an act. She couldn't just open that door, let him in, and pretend that everything was normal. How could she trust him now, after the video, after the damning message that seemed to suggest he had been orchestrating this entire thing from the start? But if Ben was involved, then what about Jake? The man who had been so helpful, so seemingly invested in finding the truth about Jason Miller's disappearance. Was he another part of the puzzle, another person who had been playing her, guiding her toward the wrong answers while hiding the truth right in front of her? The possibilities were endless, and they were all terrifying. As she paced the small apartment, her thoughts raced like a train out of control, and just when she thought she might finally lose it, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, it was a call. The name on the screen froze her in place. It was Jake. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before answering, her pulse quickening as she pressed the phone to her ear. "Sarah," Jake's voice crackled through the line, but there was a strange edge to it, something distant, almost cold. "I know you're scared. I know you're confused. But you need to listen to me. They're watching you. All of this is bigger than you realize. You've been digging in the wrong place, and now you're in danger." His words hung in the air, thick with tension, but it was the next part that made Sarah's stomach drop. "Ben's not who you think he is. You need to get away from him before it's too late. He's part of this. He's been feeding you lies to keep you in the dark. If you don't get out now, you might not make it out alive." Her heart hammered in her chest. This was it. She was being pulled into a tug-of-war, caught between two men, two people she had trusted, relied on, and believed in. But now, everything had changed. If Jake was telling the truth, if Ben had really been manipulating her from the start, then everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was for nothing. She felt sick to her stomach as the enormity of the situation began to sink in. She couldn't trust either of them, not anymore. But she had no choice but to confront them both, and that confrontation could either save her or destroy her. There was no middle ground. The phone call ended abruptly, and Sarah's hand shook as she stared at the blank screen. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts twisted in knots. She couldn't just ignore Jake's warning. Not after everything that had happened, not after the way he'd sounded so desperate, so certain that Ben was behind it all. But at the same time, there was something about Jake's voice that unsettled her too. It was almost as if he was too eager to paint Ben as the villain. What if he was lying to her, manipulating her in a different way, using her fear against her? She had to choose, but how could she choose between the two people who might hold the key to the truth? The apartment felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her, and the need to make a decision grew unbearable. She saw the door rattled again, harder this time, and Sarah's blood ran cold as she took a step back, her breath shallow, her heart hammering in her chest. Whoever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. This wasn't just a confrontation. This wasn't just about Ben, or Jake, or even Jason Miller's disappearance anymore. The truth was bigger, darker, more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and now it was closing in on her like a predator hunting its prey. The walls felt like they were pressing in, suffocating her as the reality of everything she'd uncovered began to settle in. The pieces she had thought she understood, Ben's betrayal, Jake's warnings, the strange messages, the threats, had been nothing but smoke and mirrors. The conspiracy, the one that had been lurking behind the scenes all along, was much more vast, more terrifying than she could have ever fathomed. The phone buzzed again. The message this time wasn't from either Ben or Jake. It was from an unknown number, a single sentence that chilled her to the core. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Sarah. Time's up." Her pulse spiked. It was happening. Whatever had been planned, whatever game had been played, was about to reach its devastating climax. She knew she had to act fast, but she didn't know where to start. Every second felt like an eternity, and the longer she hesitated, the more dangerous it became. The truth was slipping through her fingers like sand, and every time she thought she had a handle on it, the ground would shift beneath her. Desperation clawed at her as she rushed toward the window, pulling the blinds back just enough to peek outside. Her heart dropped into her stomach when she saw the black SUV parked across the street. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it was clear whoever was orchestrating this was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. It wasn't just Ben or Jake anymore. There were more players, more people in on this, and she was at the center of it all. But just as she turned back to the apartment, her phone rang again, this time from a name she hadn't expected to see. Her fingers froze on the screen as she saw the caller ID, Detective Vargas. The detective who had been handling the case from the beginning. The one who had always seemed to have her back. The one person who should have been her ally in all of this. With trembling hands, Sarah answered the call, her voice barely a whisper. "Detective Vargas?" "Sarah, listen to me," Vargas' voice came through, thick with urgency. "This is bigger than you know. You've been walking right into it without even realizing it." There was a long pause, as if Vargas was struggling to find the right words, and then he added, "You've been played, Sarah. The entire investigation has been a setup. The missing persons case, Jason Miller, everything, it's all connected to something far worse." The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment, her mind refused to process it. A setup. Everything. The investigation had been twisted, manipulated right under her nose. But why? What was the endgame? Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic whirlwind, and she struggled to hold on to what little clarity she had left. "Vargas, what the hell are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Who's behind this? Why has this been happening? Why me?" "There are people in positions of power, Sarah. People who've been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Ben, Jake, they're just pawns, same as you. But the game they're playing isn't about Jason Miller. It's about something much bigger. It's about money, influence, control. These people have been orchestrating disappearances, setting people up to take the fall, manipulating investigations to hide their real agenda. And you've been getting too close to the truth. You've been digging where they don't want you to." The breath caught in Sarah's throat. For a moment, she felt like she was drowning. The stakes were higher than she could have imagined. This wasn't about a missing person. This wasn't even about Ben or Jake. It was about something much darker, something so massive that it stretched its tendrils into every corner of society, weaving itself into the very fabric of the system. Sarah, you have to get out. Now. They're coming for you. You're in danger. And there's only one way out of this. Vargas' voice was shaking now, fear creeping into his tone. You have to trust me. You need to disappear. It's the only way to stay alive. The urgency in his voice sent a wave of panic crashing through her. Was this the moment? Was this the warning she needed to hear? Or was Vargas another part of the conspiracy, trying to manipulate her into making a fatal mistake? She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Everyone she'd relied on had turned out to be hiding something, playing their own game, using her to get what they wanted. But even as those thoughts ran through her head, the pounding on the door grew louder. They were here. Whoever they were. The danger had caught up with her. Sarah, listen to me. Vargas' voice cut off suddenly, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire in the background. A muffled shout. The line went dead. Her stomach twisted in horror. What the hell was happening? Was Vargas gone? Had they gotten to him too? The phone slipped from her fingers as her thoughts spiraled. The sound of the door splintering abruptly brought her back to the present, and she turned toward the sound, adrenaline surging through her veins. She wasn't going to let them take her. She couldn't. She couldn't let them win, not after everything she'd uncovered, not after everything she had sacrificed to get this far. With a burst of raw fear-fueled energy, she ran toward the window, pulling it open, desperate to escape. But as she did, the world outside froze her in place. A figure stood across the street, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight. It was Ben. No, not just Ben. He was standing with someone else, someone Sarah didn't recognize. But the worst part was that both of them were watching her, and as the figure in the shadows raised his hand, Sarah saw something glinting in the dim light. A gun. Her breath caught in her throat, the world tilting beneath her feet. She had no time to think, no time to process the truth. She had to move. She had to escape. But just as she turned to run, her phone buzzed one last time. A new message. It's too late, Sarah. You're already part of the plan. A cold wave of terror crashed over her. She wasn't just in danger. She was the target. The final piece of the puzzle. And no one, absolutely no one, was going to let her leave until she paid the price for uncovering the truth. The chase was on, and this time, she had nowhere to hide. The moment Sarah bolted for the door, the world outside seemed to collapse in on her, each step making the pounding in her chest grow louder, more frantic. She could hear the menacing footsteps echoing behind her, close now, too close for comfort. The adrenaline coursing through her veins gave her the strength to move faster, but the suffocating feeling of being hunted, of knowing they were watching, waiting for her to make a mistake, was almost too much to bear. The truth, the terrifying truth she had pieced together, was finally within her grasp, but it was as though the more she uncovered, the deeper the hole she dug, the more danger she found herself in. The game was changing. She had been a pawn all along, but now, she was something more dangerous to them. She was a threat. She ran, the city lights blurring past her as she pushed her body to the limit, her breath ragged and shallow. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. The faces that had once seemed familiar, Ben, Jake, Vargas, had all been pulled back like the strings of a puppet, controlled by a hand far more powerful than she could have imagined. The realization hit her again, and with it, the horrible truth. It had never been about Jason Miller's disappearance. That had been the cover-up. The real story, the real conspiracy, was something darker. It was about control, manipulation, and a dangerous network of people pulling the strings behind every missing person, every fabricated story, every lie they fed to the public. She stumbled to a halt at the edge of a secluded alley, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She could feel it now, they were closing in. She could hear the low hum of a car engine in the distance, slowly getting closer, and she knew they were coming for her. They had caught her scent. They weren't going to stop until she was silenced. And they had no idea how close she was to the truth. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She didn't have much time. She turned her head just in time to see a shadow move across the alleyway ahead of her, the figure's silhouette casting a dark, ominous shape against the dim streetlight. She didn't have to see the face to know who it was. Ben. Sarah, his voice called out, too calm, too smooth. We don't have to do this. You're playing right into their hands. You've been lied to, manipulated, and now they want you to be a part of it all. Don't you see? You're not the only one caught in this. Her pulse spiked, a wave of dread washing over her. Ben had always been one step ahead, always had that air of control, but something about his tone now felt off, almost desperate. Was this the moment? Was this the confrontation that would finally bring the whole twisted game into the light? Ben, stop. I don't know what you're part of, but I'm done being a pawn. I'm done with all of this. Her voice was trembling, the weight of the last few hours making her falter. She wanted to be strong, but the truth, this ugly, terrifying truth, was too much. It was too heavy to carry. Ben took a step closer, his face finally emerging from the shadows, but the look in his eyes was cold, unreadable. You think you know everything, but you don't. You never did. He paused, his lips curling into a barely perceptible smile. You've been chasing ghosts, Sarah. The person you think you're looking for isn't the real enemy. They never were. Her heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who are you protecting? Who's behind all of this? Ben's eyes flickered, and then he sighed, as though the weight of the confession was too much to hold in any longer. It's not about Jason. It never was. You're just another victim, another person they used. But you're the one they didn't count on. You're the one who got too close. The truth was starting to come together, but as she pieced it all together in her mind, one last horrifying realization struck her. There had been something wrong from the beginning, the subtle way Vargas had guided her, the way Ben had always been there when she needed help, and the way Jake had warned her at just the right moment. They were all connected. They were all part of something so big, so dangerous, that even now, she could barely comprehend it. But there was something else, someone else, who had been playing her all along. Jake, Sarah whispered, her heart clenching. Jake is in on it, isn't he? Ben nodded slowly, his expression hardening. You don't get it, do you? Jake isn't just part of the scheme. He's the mastermind. He's the one who set everything in motion. He's the one who knew exactly what to feed you, when to keep you going, and when to pull you back. You've been chasing his every move, playing right into his hands. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. Jake. The man who had appeared so helpful, so genuine, he was behind it all? The one person who had seemed like a lifeline in this storm had been the one pulling the strings the entire time? The betrayal was more than she could bear, and her mind raced as she tried to understand how she had been so blind. Before she could process it further, the sound of a car screeching to a halt nearby made her jump. The SUV. The one that had been tailing her since the beginning. She didn't have time. They were closing in on her, and the walls were closing fast. Ben turned to look at the vehicle, his face hardening. This is it, Sarah. You're either with us now, or you're out. But there's no running from this. No turning back. Ben, she said, stepping back, her voice growing desperate. What do you want from me? Why didn't you just tell me the truth? Because you didn't need to know, he replied, voice cold. Now, you've left us no choice. The game's over. Just as Sarah felt herself slip into the abyss, the world seemed to stop. The car door opened. A figure emerged from the shadows, and it wasn't Jake. It wasn't Vargas, either. It was the last person she had expected to see, Detective Vargas, alive, standing tall, his face a mask of stone. He stepped forward, his hand raised in a slow, deliberate motion. I told you, Sarah, he said, his voice low, you've been asking the wrong questions. You've been chasing the wrong answers. The truth was right in front of you. Jake, Ben, they were never the ones you needed to fear. In that moment, Sarah's world crumbled. Vargas wasn't just involved, he was the one who had been orchestrating everything from the start. The entire investigation had been a setup. He was the final piece of the puzzle. He had been leading her down a path, playing her just as much as Ben and Jake had. The conspiracy was not just about power, or money, or control. It was about manipulating the narrative, controlling the people who might get too close to the truth, making sure that no one ever discovered what was really going on. And Sarah. She had been the one they used to tie it all together. But in that final, heart-stopping moment, as the gun in Vargas' hand glinted under the streetlights, she realized one thing: the story wasn't over. The battle hadn't even begun. She had one last chance to take control of the narrative. One last chance to turn everything around. But would she survive to tell the tale? That was the question that would haunt her and the audience for the rest of her life. The gun cocked. The world held its breath. And then everything went dark. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. The gun's cold barrel pressed against Sarah's temple, the tension in the air so thick that it felt like every breath she took would be her last. Detective Vargas stood there, a figure of unwavering control, but behind his eyes, something had shifted. The world felt like it had come to a halt, as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Sarah stood frozen, her thoughts racing 1,000 miles per minute, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, everything that had led to this very moment. She had uncovered the conspiracy, exposed the betrayal, and yet here she was, the final piece in a dangerous game, with nowhere to run. She had trusted Vargas, trusted the system, and now she was faced with the bitter reality that everything had been a lie. But as the weight of that realization settled in, something else stirred inside her, a spark of defiance, a burning desire to not let them win. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Vargas's hand trembled, just slightly, and for a moment. It seemed like he might lower the gun. But then the moment passed, and the tension only thickened. His voice, when it came, was cold and controlled, but there was an underlying weariness in it that Sarah had never noticed before. You should have stayed away, Sarah. You should have let it go. You didn't have to get involved, but now, he paused, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge her reaction. Now, you've made yourself part of the plan. You can't walk away from this. Sarah felt a surge of strength coursing through her as she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't going to let this man, or anyone else, control her anymore. The truth she had fought for, no matter how dark, how dangerous, was the only thing that had kept her going. It was what had driven her to this moment, and she wasn't going to let fear define her. I'm not part of your plan, Vargas. I'm not anyone's pawn. The words were like a declaration, a final act of rebellion against everything she had uncovered, against everything they had tried to make her believe. She wasn't just some victim in their game. She was the one holding the cards now. The gun wavered in Vargas's hand, but then, just as quickly as the tension had built, it seemed to deflate. His shoulders slumped, and with a sigh, he lowered the weapon, stepping back slightly. You don't understand, Sarah. It was never about the truth for me. It was about survival. In this world, people like us don't get to ask questions without consequences. We don't get to dig too deep or we end up buried. His voice cracked with a vulnerability she had never expected from him. It was the first time she saw the man behind the badge, the human who had been just as trapped as she had been. He was a product of the very system he had sworn to uphold, twisted by the same web of lies he had helped weave. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Vargas wasn't a villain. He was just another victim of the conspiracy, a cog in a machine that had swallowed him whole, and now, like her, he was trying to escape it. But I didn't give up, Sarah. I couldn't. Not after everything I've seen. And now, I'm just trying to make it out alive. The rawness of his admission hung in the air between them, like a fragile thread. She could feel the weight of his words settling in, and for a brief moment, her anger faded. The humanity in Vargas's eyes was undeniable, and it made her question everything she had thought she knew. But there was no time for sympathy. No time for second chances. The game had already changed. And there was one final truth Sarah needed to uncover, the last piece of the puzzle that had eluded her all along. With a swift motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, crumpled piece of paper she had found in the forest, the one with the cryptic message written on it. She hadn't told Vargas about it, hadn't even shared it with Ben or Jake. It was her final piece of leverage, the one thing that might still give her a way out. As she unfolded it, her heart skipped a beat. There, in jagged handwriting, was one final name, Jake Keller. It was the name she hadn't wanted to believe, The name that had been staring her in the face all along. Jake. The one person she had trusted completely. The one person who had seemed to be the only ally she had left. The one person who had betrayed her from the beginning. As she read the message again, the meaning was clear. Jake wasn't just part of the conspiracy. He was the mastermind. He had orchestrated everything from the start, pulling the strings and setting the pieces into motion. He had been playing a long game, and she had been the final pawn in it. The realization hit Sarah like a wave, crashing over her with such force that she nearly stumbled. Jake had never been her ally. He had been using her from the start, manipulating her into doing exactly what he wanted, exposing the conspiracy, getting too close to the truth. He had made her believe that she was fighting for justice, when in reality, she was just another tool in his plan. The weight of the betrayal was almost too much to bear, but there was no time to dwell on it. She had to act. She had to stop him before it was too late. But then, just as the final pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Vargas's face hardened. "You think you're free," he spat, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You think you can just walk away? You've already made your choice. There's no going back." The sirens grew louder still, and Sarah's heart sank. The authorities were closing in. But it wasn't just the police she had to worry about. Jake had connections, and if he was really behind all of this, then she was never truly safe. The conspiracy ran deeper than she had ever imagined, and the people involved had their fingers in every part of the system. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. As Vargas turned to leave, he shot her one last look. "I don't know how this ends for you, Sarah. But I hope you find peace, even if it's only for a moment." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She was no longer sure of anything. The twists, the lies, the betrayals, they had all led to this point, and now, it was out of her hands. She could only wait to see where the story would go from here. The screen went black. The final shot was a lingering look at Sarah's face, haunted, uncertain, but resolute. As the credits began to roll, the audience was left with a question that would linger long after the video ended. Had Sarah truly uncovered the truth, or was she now just another victim in a much larger game? The conspiracy was still out there, still lurking, still waiting for someone else to expose it. And as the last note played, one final thought flashed across the screen. The story was far from over. Ould feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her chest, suffocating her with every breath she took. On the one hand, she could confront Ben, accuse him of everything Jake had suggested, and try to force the truth out of him. But what if Jake was wrong? On the other hand, if she confronted Jake, could she trust him? What if he was part of the conspiracy as well, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, manipulating her into going after Ben for his own purposes? The door rattled again, louder this time, and Sarah flinched, her heart racing. Whoever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. She had to make a choice, and the longer she waited, the closer the danger came. "Sarah, I know you're scared. But you don't have much time. If you want to know the truth, come to me. I'll tell you everything. You'll understand why this has to end. But you need to trust me. Don't let them manipulate you. If you want to survive, you have to choose a side." Sarah's breath hitched as the finality of those words settled in. He was giving her an ultimatum. Trust him, or trust Jake. There was no way to win. No matter what she chose, the truth would come with a price. Her thoughts spiraled as the sound of footsteps echoed outside her door. Her pulse raced, the weight of the decision crashing down on her. The walls were closing in, and she realized with terrifying clarity that no matter which side she chose, there was no escaping the consequences. She was in too deep now. It was too late to walk away. But the truth, the one thing she had been chasing this whole time, might destroy her in the end. She needed to decide. And soon. Because whoever was outside her door wasn't going to wait forever.